Good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome all of you who are joining us today in the room and also say a special hello to everybody joining us on live stream today. This event is being live streamed. My name is Katie Rosenberger, and I am the CEO of AMSA. And on behalf of my team and the All Welcome Here Coalition, I have the privilege of hosting the event today. I begin by acknowledging the inherent privilege that we have by gathering on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, and I express my gratitude to them. I live on the unceded and ancestral territory of the Semiahmoo First Nation, and I honor them as well. We do a territorial acknowledgement when we gather to express the knowledge that we have that we are on land that is stolen and unceded, that there were people and societies thriving here since time immemorial, and those people welcomed our ancestors when they arrived on the shores of Turtle Island. That since first contact, Indigenous people opened their homes and their hearts to the newcomers, showing them how to survive using a deep understanding and relationship to the land. 500 years ago, we were taught what a welcoming community looks like. However, it was a lesson that was not honored or reciprocated, and the genocide of Indigenous people began. What instead took hold was the lesson of colonization, settler societies, othering, and a system of discrimination that is still rooted in many of our policies and institutions today. As a society, we have a deeply tarnished record of welcoming those who followed us to these unceded lands. And as a sector centered on migration, we are continuously asking ourselves how we balance the commitment we have to the safe migration of those seeking refuge to these lands that are not ours. Some of us gathered in a dialogue this past April where we examined this very question. We learned from elders of the welcoming nature of Indigenous society, of the compassion of the people to comfort and provide shelter to those in need. That when someone is suffering or needs a helping hand, that help is given without question and always with compassion. The All Welcome Here Coalition came together over the past few months to reflect on the ideas of comfort, shelter, a helping hand, and compassion. We talked about refugees coming from abroad to find safety for their children. We talked about asylum seekers crossing the Canadian border in the hopes of creating a life for themselves and their families. We talked about our experiences with refugees in Canada and examined the facts and the research to support what we already knew, that refugees are not a burden to Canada, they are an opportunity. And we did all of this while watching the discourse about refugees in mainstream and social media growing more and more negative and rooted in untruths. At AMSA, we have reflected on the welcoming that our ancestors received when they arrived hundreds of years ago, and are inspired by the continual commitment of our Indigenous partners to welcome people to safety despite the way they have been treated since first contact. We have reflected on our privilege and our desire to see all newcomers today treated with the same respect, regardless of how they arrive here. Instant access to information has deeply impacted the way we communicate. And while there is a huge societal benefit to the way we can access information, there is also a serious concern with how information is managed and vetted. Stories that are posted as fact can often be riddled with errors or completely fictitious. So our purpose today is threefold. One is to hear the stories of folks who have come here as refugees so we can understand the journey that they take to arrive here safely and integrate into their communities. Two is to pull apart the myths that are out there about refugees and learn about the facts of refugee migration and settlement in Canada. And three, the ultimate goal is to show the same respect and humanitarianism to all newcomers that was shown to our ancestors. I would like to introduce Adrienne de Jager, Associate Vice President of Government Relations and Community Engagement with UBC.
Thank you, Katie, and good evening, everybody. UBC is proud to sponsor this event, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this important and timely discussion. Katie has very eloquently acknowledged the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. And as Katie has pointed out, acknowledging our Indigenous hosts is an important reminder of the role settlement and migration have played in the history of this land many of us now call home. Questions on migration and settlement pervade our social discourse, and the related stories of tragedy and opportunity seem to come with increasing volume and intensity. We've also witnessed how questions on migration and settlement have been weaponized in public discourse, being used as tools to divide and spread fear. But by bringing people together with lived experiences, experts in the field, and you, we hope we will shine new light onto these issues. Tonight's event is presented by AMSA and UBC Migration. As many of you know, AMSA stands for the Affiliation of Multicultural Societies and Service Agencies of BC. Since 1977, they've been providing a range of capacity building support services for newcomers serving organizations in British Columbia, including networking and training events and producing relevant information resources. AMSA also convenes a broad range of groups to discuss and collaborate on migration, economic, and BC community inclusion issues, as they're doing tonight. The UBC Migration Group brings together researchers from a wide range of disciplines to understand and engage in debate about the drivers and consequences of international migration through research, education, and outreach. I'd like to thank both for all the work they've done in this field, and particularly give thanks to AMSA for organizing tonight's important event. I'd also like to thank the panelists for generously giving their time and insightful analysis, and I'd like to thank you all again for being here tonight. We also want your feedback, and so we'll be using Slido, so please keep your eyes on the screen behind me. At the end of the night, we're going to do a poll for your feedback, which we'd love to hear. I hope you find the evening both thoughtful and thought-provoking. Thank you.
Mic is definitely higher for you than it was for me. Okay, so some housekeeping items. I will ask everyone to please put your phones onto silent or step out if you need to take a call. While you have your phones out of your pockets, we are going to get everybody onto Slido. So if you haven't used Slido before, it is a pretty wonderful way of communicating at events like this. Basically, it allows you to input your question into the app or through the online portal, and then people can vote on the questions, and it bumps it up to the top so we know how many people want to hear the answer to that question. So we'll be using that at the latter part of the day. The first 90 minutes or so is going to be moderated, but once we get to the Q&A from the audience, we will then go on to Slido. So if you could go to slido.com, and then the meeting code is right there, the event code. If you want to use an app, you can use an app instead. You can just go into your browser. And then if you are not comfortable using Slido or you don't have a handheld device, when we do get round to the Q&A, you can just put your hand up if you wanted to ask a question, and we will have an opportunity to either bring the mic over, see how we're doing for time, or we also have index cards and Sharpies, so you can do it that way. So we have many ways to get there, but we will get you there. I do want to begin also by saying that, AMSA and UBC, we respect freedom of speech and expression. This can sometimes be a sensitive topic for people, and I want to just reiterate what most of you, I'm sure, already know, that we will not tolerate disrespectful comments or behavior or hate speech. And so we do ask that everybody be respectful of the individuals that are in the room and the individuals that are watching online with your comments and your questions. So this is the fun part of the evening. I get to have the distinct pleasure of introducing our refugee lived experience folks. So oftentimes in the media, refugees are broken down into statistics and are the topic of policy debates. And today we want to show the human side of the refugee experience. We want to provide a platform for folks who arrived as refugees to Canada to tell their own story in their own voice, rather than have anyone else speaking for them, while keeping in mind that retelling these stories can sometimes be re-traumatizing and very brave in front of a large audience like this. This is why we ask you, the audience, to be respectful of our presenters today. We also want to demystify what happens to folks who arrive in Canada as refugees. What happens 2 years, 10 years, 20 years after you arrive? What are the experiences of struggle and triumph? Because as we know, no matter what category you arrive to Canada under, if you're a skilled worker, or you're a refugee or an international student, you come through family class, economic class, there's always some level of struggle coupled with triumphs and successes. I would like to introduce to you first Munifa. Munifa Ahmed is founder of a technology solution called EcoMeat Platform and passionate advocate for Mother Earth. She has moved to Canada in 2017 as a refugee claimant and was able to successfully launch her professional career as a digital analyst. Please welcome Munifa.
Hi, everyone. My name is Munifa, and I migrated to Canada in 2017 from Saudi Arabia as a refugee. Though I was born and raised in Saudi Arabia, my family originally came from Ethiopia. They moved to Saudi for work opportunities. Thanks to Canada for opening the doors for refugees, currently, I'm working as a digital analyst and pursuing my passion for climate advocacy, women leadership, and refugees. But it was not easy to get here. At this stage, I started over in Toronto and spent more than 6 months in a shelter. I was looking for a job, a place to live, and opportunities to continue my education. I didn't know how to build a network or navigate the system. Although I got the opportunities to survive, I had to figure out how to thrive. I felt confused about what to do or where to go. Things can be different now. I believe services can be enhanced to have a productive outcome. And that is through tailored services, through design thinking, through reverse engineering the problem itself. That means listening and creating and iterating, all based on your client needs. Because the solution of today is not a destination. It is a stepping stone for a better tomorrow. Remember, data without an action is useless. But you know what? It's not fair to blame it all on settlement agency. Integration is a process that can only be achieved through collaboration. Collaboration of settlement agency, media outlet, and of course, the support of the community. For refugees like me, sharing our story is not as simple as it may seem. When the media or settlement agency, they provide a platform to share our journey, it's not done properly lots of the time. First and foremost, it is re-traumatizing for people to share their journey, which is often includes a lot of struggle and violence. The end product is portraying refugees as victims. Too many loud, needy people who drain the country's resources. But that is furthest it could be from the truth. The truth is, refugees are survivors. They are passionate, resilient people who only are looking for one thing, a safe place to call home. I notice news media only approaches refugees when they are victims or visionaries. There is no middle sound ground. How about refugees are just normal people like you and me? The real question is, how do we normalize and facilitate the appearance of minorities on different platforms? How do we respect the privacy of those who are bravely willing to share? How do we elevate the anxiety around them feeling the need to justify why they are here? How do we lift the pressure around them feeling to need to prove they struggled enough to deserve to be here? All answers start with a simple fact. Except for indigenous people, We are all settlers here. No one is more Canadian than others. We are as Canadians as other settlers that calls this country home. Although it was fairly challenging to make it here, thanks to Canada again for opening its doors for refugees. I am saying this with a full heart of gratitude that I am lucky to be a woman in Canada. I am lucky to be a refugee to Canada. So now, how we can move from just being a refugee to what I want to be. Since moving to BC a year ago, I had the opportunities to explore and find my passion for nature. I learned new tech skills such as coding and digital marketing. Through various initiatives and organizations like Diversity City and Beyond Borders that had helped me realize my potential and took me beyond my limits. Currently, I am incubating our platform at Founder Institute. Through our technology solution, we are trying to address the gap between climate conversation and climate action. How? By helping organizations engage employees in gamified community experience to reduce their carbon footprint collectively. We are looking for introduction of funding to pilot our app by January 2020. Now, I am finally here in Canada, where I am able to work, study, and pursue my passion with the collective community support. Nevertheless, almost most of the world had turned their back on us. I will follow Canada's footsteps, and I will never turn my back on world crisis. Thank you.
Munifa, that was brilliant. Thank you. Oh, I'm going back and forth and back. There we go. So I now get the pleasure of introducing Dashus Richardson. Dashus arrived in Canada in 2011 with his family as a privately sponsored refugee. He's currently a student pursuing a degree in sports science and coaching at Douglas College. He's a dedicated community volunteer as co-leader for the Surrey Refugee Youth Team, Canadian Council for Refugees Youth Network, and sits on a variety of advisory committees. Dashus organizes an annual soccer tournament for at-risk youth, refugee, and immigrant youth in Surrey to engage and connect them to the community through sport. He works as an outreach worker, a wrestling coach, and a mentor in public schools across Surrey and Delta, and he was recently nominated for a BC Multiculturalism Award. Please help me welcome Dashus to the stage.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dashus Richardson. I'm from Liberia, West Africa. I want you to listen to my story. I don't want you to find me pity, but I want you to know that this story I'm about to tell you is a success. So, I was born during the time of Civil War. So Liberia went through Civil War. And I experienced trauma. I saw many things that a child or kid shouldn't have seen. I don't know, many of you have experienced such pain, sorrow, at a very young age. During the time of war, while I was walking with my grandmom, I saw my friend's dead body, and I froze. And the rebel came and asked me, a little boy, what are you crying? What could I say? He then pulled someone out from the crowd. In my presence, shot them in the head. Could you imagine a little child seeing such death, witnessing something that will stick with him for the rest of his life? Nevertheless, I moved on with my family to the American embassy in Liberia. 10 feet away from me, bomb exploded. A lot of people died. My uncle and I were the only one that survived with blood covered on our bodies. That's trauma. That's something that could get me what? Mental illness. So, I moved to Canada in the year 2011. So after my dad left the country, because he has to leave, at that time, they were looking for men to join the rebel. So when I was born, I never knew who my father was. However, he brought me here to seek opportunity, to get a better education, to experience a better life for myself and for others. I came here along with my two sisters, but I left someone important back home that I was so dear to, my mom, my grandmom, who I haven't seen for almost 9 years, up to now. Coming here, I was 13 years old, going to school, I found it very difficult to fit in. How can I start life with someone who I don't even know, my father? I don't know anything about him, but I just know that he's my father. I miss my mom. So why or how did I fit in? That's something I was good at, sports. I'm a good soccer player. However, I found passion in another sport, wrestling. And whenever I'm playing sport, the memories, the pain, the sorrow is all wiped away. The tears is gone away. But the moment I get back home in my little cover, I then realize I have to face this battle alone because it's only me and no one else. I was very shy. I never talked. But sport helped me. There are times in the classroom when the teacher asks me, Dashes, do you know this? I have an answer to it, but I cannot say why, because I'm afraid to speak because of my accent. I'm afraid that people will laugh at me. But sport helped me. I also get involved in my school to volunteering. And through that, I found, connection, reaching out to people. I was open to talk to people. Then I started to fit in. And I got this opportunity where, the media came, the province newspaper came to interview me about wrestling. But then this guy, he asked me, the reporter, oh, Dasha, there's something I know about Liberia. Were you in Liberia during the time of the war? That was the first time anyone that knew me, that was the first time I opened up to talk about where I'm from and what I went through. I never tell anyone. My father didn't know. But when that came out, it brought sorrow. It brought back memories. I would go to bed. I try to sleep. I can't. My eyes open, but I'm still seeing those things that happened to me. It's trauma, anxiety, pain. I'm in that box, crying every day. There's something in me that I'm fighting, but how can I fight this? Sport helped me. Volunteering helped me. However, I'm here to go to school, to seek education, to get opportunity, to support my mom back home, my siblings back home, who I still send money to up to this day for education. How old am I? Do you guys know? I'm 22. I'm very young. I help myself. I go to school. I'm determined. But sport helped me. So, I realized that I never really had a good upbringing in my youthful days. I never experienced good things because of the war. So now I have this opportunity to be in Canada. How can I help the youth? That is why I'm so passionate about giving back to my community, especially with the youth. I got involved in volunteering with the Surrey Refugee Youth Team, the Canadian Council for Refugee Youth Network, and other youth group around the country, and also different organizations in BC. I know this may sound crazy that I'm all over the place volunteering, right? But no, that helped me to find peace. It helped me to find connection, to forget about all these things that went on my past, because I don't have it anymore. So I funded the Surrey Youth Soccer Tournament. The goal for that tournament is to bring youth, mostly reaching out to refugee youth, immigrant youth, at-risk youth, to give them the opportunity to come together, to bond, because I never really had that. I wish I did. But yeah, I am creating opportunity for the next generation, because I know how painful it is. There are many youth that come here that want to get connected, but they don't know where to go, how. But sports help me. I'm creating that change for them. So I have run the soccer tournament for 3 years. First year, we have 50 youth that participated. Second year, 200 youth. Third year, which was this year, 400 plus youths. It's something that it's growing every year. It's not about the numbers, it's about the impact it makes to the youth. Like I said, though I established that, but I don't see it as my problem. It's the issue of the community. So we all have to face this. It's for the youth, it's not for me. Yeah, I am in Canada, having this opportunity to go to school, to get a better education. It's a blessing. Not many of us have it. I still remember, I'm not the only person that saw those things that happened to me. There are youth back home in Liberia that witness similar things as me. They are suffering from mental illness. How can we help them? How can we help them? How can we help youths? Because they are the next generation. Look at our society today. Youth are doing things that are different from what a youth that we know 13 years old before. When I was 13, I used to play in the rain. I used to play in the dirt. But 13 years old now, the things they do, you won't believe it. But how can we attach them to something that would distract them from the war? That is what I organized the soccer tournament. But like I said from the beginning, my story is not something for you to sympathize with me. I'm telling you my story because it has made impact in my life. It has changed me from who I am. It has made me stronger into a young man who I am today. I never look down on myself. I always have this dream of going further. Though I don't have anyone else to help me, but I know I have the Lord. So I want to say that we, refugees in Canada, we are here to seek opportunity. We are not burdened. And those opportunities that we have, we give back to our community because we're not selfish. We do not keep it to ourselves. We want other people to benefit from it. And this message is for all of you guys. Whatever vision a young man or a young woman have, he or she may bring it to you. And if you want to, push forward that vision, if not, but it's something that will impact not their life only, but for all. Support it. Get involved, get engaged. So today, I want to say thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to you. I never really used to talk. I was very shy. But yeah, I am today talking. I still feel shaky right now because I just explained things that happened to me and it's just bringing back the memories. But don't feel sorry for me. I've succeeded. I've overcome this circumstance. And I'm moving to a higher height. because Canada have given me that opportunity to become who I am today. Thank you.
Dashus Richardson, you are an incredible human being. And I now have the honor of introducing Pascaline Sekera. Pascaline is originally from Burundi. In 1997, she arrived to Canada as a World University Services of Canada scholar, so WUSC. I always get that one, WUSC scholar, through UBC, where she completed a degree in science and furthered her studies at UVic in social work. She is currently a program manager of Programme d'Immigration Francophone de l'ACB, BC Francophone Immigration Program at la Fédération de Francophones de la Colombie-Britannique. Please welcome Pascaline.
This just means I don't need these notes. Good evening, everyone. I just want to thank the AMSA. I want to thank the UBC team. I want to thank the panelists, and I want to thank my fellow refugee or former refugees, Munifa and Dashus, for your moving stories. It's actually really hard to give this talk. But I truly feel privileged for me to be part of this event as a UBC alumni, a former UBC staff, and a WUSC UBC refugee-sponsored student. I'm very happy, especially because this will help me to appreciate the good work that's being done by some of the students who actually still doing this work and who helped me settle in Canada. I want also to thank you all for your presence here. I want to thank especially people who are working very hard to make refugees feel welcome. So, my story is actually very old because when they asked me to speak on this topic, I told Bahar, I say, are you sure you want to hear from me? Because my story is so old. It was 1997 when I came to Canada. So do you feel like it's a relevant story? And she said, yes. She said, it's very important to hear about what happened after 1 year, 3 years, and even 20 years. So my story, what I can say, I've just noticed some similarities in terms of our stories. Munifa, her story, Dashus, but I think refugee experience and journeys change people, and for the better. And I want to repeat again what Dashus said, that refugees are resilient people. They are like you and I, but they show that in the midst of difficulties and tremendous tragedy, a human being can remain resilient and good things can come out of it. So my story, I would say, my refugee journey, though traumatic, has taught me to believe in humanity again. And you would say, why? I will just share with you just briefly what happened. It started in 1993. I was a young woman. I had just enrolled at university in my native country, Burundi, where I was born and grew up. I had never seen war before, except in movies. And in fact, I have a very fond memory of my life as a child in Burundi, and as a student, even though Burundi, by Canadian standard, is a poor country. There was a lot of community, a lot of family support, and I grew up happy. I was a university student, very curious, very ambitious. I want to finish my studies, go to work, maybe go to Europe, further my studies, and come back and help the country and help my family. I was all excited. But in 1993, it all came to a halt because the war, because of political tension. There was a war that broke, which contributed to people being so polarized and eventually turned into a civil war, people killing each other. At first, it was along political lines, only we thought politician and army, but eventually it spilled into the general population. Our university campus was not spared, and the campus became a battleground because students also became polarized. I, coming from the two opposite sides, at that Burundi is made by two, we call it ethnic, I don't believe it's ethnic, a group called Hutu and Tutsi, and my parents, one was Hutu, one was Tutsi. It was difficult because I could not take sides, and also people would not trust me. Things went so bad that in 1995, many students died. Students killed each other in the campus, and there was a terrible massacre. At that time, we were on and off, going to school, sometimes not, because there were a lot of fighting around the university and in the university. And after this massacre, things really went bad. And then one friend of mine, she was actually a cousin, she told me that she had seen my name on the list of people they didn't want on campus. She began crying. She begged me to leave the campus, and she begged me to never tell anyone because she would be in trouble. So this was what precipitated my escape. Luckily, I had been very involved in my spare time in some church group, and we were working on some peace and reconciliation work. I was volunteering. And at that time, I had been, by chance, I was asked to go to South Africa for training. So a few days after I left, things actually went bizarre because Burundi was, the international community imposed economic sanction on Burundi, on the military regime, to force it to negotiate with the civilians. And because of this sanction, borders were closed. I could not go back, even if I wanted. At that time, I don't think I wanted to go back. But I did not plan that I was going to stay outside of Burundi because I didn't know. I just went for this training. So my sponsors suggest I should move to Kenya because it was closer to Burundi. They had an office there, and until the borders would open. In Kenya, my visa of 3 months ran out quickly, and because of the sanction, my visa could not be renewed. So by that time, my sponsors also were complaining that I was costing them too much. So this led me to go seek protection at the UNHCR, and also to inquire about training and studies, because I truly wanted to support myself. I was directed to an organization called Window Trust, which is a partner to another organization, Canadian organization called the World University Services of Canada. And then this was the beginning of an amazing journey to Canada. Within 9 months, I had gone through TOEFL, English and TOEFL tests. I had been chosen by UBC, by the World University Services of Canada, UBC branch, to continue my study in Vancouver. So I landed in Canada in 1997. I was welcomed like a celebrity by enthusiastic students and compassionate students, supportive students. They helped me all throughout. I'm still friends to many of them. They taught me a lot about Canada, and also they were very curious about learning about the world from my perspective. So my refugee experience really changed me, and it changed my life. above all, it made me question who I was, why things were happening the way they were happening. It also showed me how people can be kind. I had seen really the bad side of humans, but then I also saw that there was still hope. So at that time when I was university, we were very fired up students. We did a lot of campaign. I mean, I don't know how it is right now at UBC, but I remember we were campaigning every day for all kinds of issues: war, refugee, racism, and discrimination. We were just all such a dynamic group. Lots of initiatives were born, like African Awareness, African Network. Even the African Study Program, I don't know if it still exists right now, was the beginning of that program. So we continued this work with some of my friends in the community. We started different initiatives, the Comeza Refugee Empowerment Society, the Burundian community, the Illustrated Junior Youth Program, and all kinds of initiative, all to see that we could make a difference. And I was extremely passionate, like, as that shows, I mean, not to the same level, but because your work is amazing. But just to tell you that even I changed my focus. I was in science at that time when I was in Burundi. I tried to continue in my area of study, which was chemistry, environmental chemistry. But I ended up getting really interested in social issues and totally changing into social work because I wanted to help. I wanted to do something. And that's what led me to my work, which I do today, working with the refugees and immigrants at the Francophone Immigration Program. So, all in all, I think, as Dashus has said, lots of traumatic things. But what I know that is because of the resilience of refugees want a chance. They want a home to help them rebuild their life and continue. And they are very keen on giving back. So they have a lot to give, and they just need the chance. And the stories have shown that when this chance is given, they make the most use of it, and they are ready to give back. In my case, after 3 years in Canada, I was able to complete my study and to get into the workforce. I have been working since, and I'm very thankful for that. So that's why, for me, it's so important to have this conversation and to correct some of the misconception. Refugees are an asset. They have talents. Many are incredibly, all of them. I mean, each one has something to give to Canada. And I want to salute and celebrate, actually, the contribution of the many successful refugees. Not all are outstanding stories, but they do what they can in their communities, volunteering, helping elderly, helping youth here and there. So we need to continue to celebrate their story, their humanity, and their contribution. I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pascaline. So I would now like to invite the panel to come up and take their seats. And while our panel is making their way up to the stage, I would like to introduce Yang Yang Zhou. Yang Yang is an assistant professor in the political science department at UBC. She researches issues of migration, identity, and development in the Global South, particularly how the presence of refugees affects host communities. Her current projects are in Tanzania, Afghanistan, and the US-Mexico border, and Colombia. Prior to obtaining her PhD, she was a case manager for the Bellevue NYU Program for Survivors of Torture, which provides medical and mental health services for asylum seekers in New York City. So the way this is going to go, I'm going to step back now, and Young Young is going to moderate the panel. Young Young has questions for the group. Please do input your questions on Slido if you feel like you have a burning question that you would like to ask when the Q&A part comes around. Young Young, I think we're going to go probably about an hour, and then we'll check in, and I'm sitting right over there, so we'll keep track of time, but you guys just do your thing, and thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, Katie. I'm so delighted to moderate this evening's panel discussion. Tonight, we will be discussing what refugees coming to BC and to Canada means in terms of the following themes. First, the social, cultural, and economic integration of refugees into local communities. Issues of fairness and security with respect to the refugee legal system. And Canada's responsibility. Is the state doing too much or not enough? And relatedly, why should we as Canadians care? Before we begin, I must come clean and admit that I'm not Canadian. I'm an American who moved to BC very recently. So from my perspective, as both an academic studying these issues from across the border, and as a newcomer, I'm here to listen and to learn. So this panel discussion will be about an hour, then we will open it up for Q&A to the audience. Audience members here in person and online, please submit your questions on Slido anytime during the panel discussion. So now I would like to introduce our panelists. Our panelists today include two of our Canadian residents with lived experience as refugees whom you've just met, Dashis Richardson and Pascaline Sequeira. Joining them are Dr. Antje Ellerman, who is an associate professor of political science at UBC. She's also the director of the Institute for European Studies and the co-lead of the UBC Migration Research Excellence Cluster. Her research focuses on the politics of immigration and citizenship in North America and Europe. Next, we have Kay Scorer, who is an immigration and human rights lawyer and a proud member of the transgender community. Kay uses they/them pronouns. They practice extensively in the areas of refugees and admissibility, both at the Immigration and Refugee Board as well as the Federal Court of Canada. Next, Dr. Sherilyn Jordan. Sherilyn Jordan has advocated with lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer refugees since 2004 as a community organizer with Rainbow Refugee and as a professor in counseling psychology at Simon Fraser University. Celebrating 20 years in 2020, Rainbow Refugee is the first Canadian organization to focus on support people fleeing homophobic, transphobic, or HIV-related persecution, and proud stewards of the Rainbow Refugee Assistance Program. And finally, we have Dr. Suzanne Hewitt, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy at UBC, where she co-leads UBC Migration with Dr. Antje Ellerman. Suzanne's research examines the experiences of forced and voluntary international migrants to Canada with a specific focus on French-speaking newcomers. Can we please give a round of applause to our panelists? So for the first question, I'm going to start off with Suzanne. But I'd also like to hear from Dashis and Sherilyn. What is happening overseas that is creating the need for refugee resettlement? Where are most refugees coming from, and how do they come to Canada?
So I won't answer that exactly, but I think that it's a great question to ask. Because I think in order to begin this conversation, often when we're talking about refugees, we tend to look out, right? So we tend to problematize other countries, right? So what is wrong over there that is causing people to come? And I think that we don't look as closely at our own country's complicity in what is generating those movements. So in terms of what is causing forced migration, and I tend to refer to it as forced migration because it is something that people aren't choosing. It's people are compelled to flee. So often it's because of the kinds of things that we've heard about, where there's civil unrest, civil conflict, where there is war. But increasingly, and I believe you might speak to this, there are just very diverse forms of persecution that people experience that lead them to need to leave. And and we're hearing more and more about climate refugees as well, is where people just cannot eke out livings where they are anymore because so much has happened. And I think taking this global perspective is essential because we are indeed living in a global society where we want free movement of goods and capital, but we resist the free movement of people. And so we don't want to pay a lot of money for our clothes, but we don't want people fleeing very uncertain economic circumstances to come and seek out opportunity here. And I think that you can't have it both ways. We either live in a global society or we don't. And if we choose to live globally, then we have to enable people to move throughout the globe. Yeah, and so maybe you need to reiterate the question for people to follow up on that.
Yes. So refugee come to Canada due to war, crisis, economic crisis from the country. So where I can relate with my story, like I came here because I wanted to seek opportunity, but it's because my country faced civil war that went on for 14 years. And, it went on for 14 years, like I said, and, it was very difficult. But how can I get out of that area? That's how my dad was able to, bring me here. But my dad left the country as a refugee. He came from Colombia also as a refugee to Canada, and so he sponsored me to come here. So, war, economic crisis are things that brought more refugees here. And with the recent refugees that moved to Canada, and we look at where they're from, we would say like Syria. I think that's in the past years, that's where most refugee comes from. It's also because of the war that it's going on in their country.
I'd just like to add to that we are seeing unprecedented levels of forced migration, and some of the factors that contribute to that are exacerbating inequality. We are still working through the exploitation and inequalities created globally through colonization. We are seeing an accumulation of wealth at the top. That means that things like civil war, when they erupt, people must flee in order to just have a basic livelihood. It also means that there's sort of a politics of us and them or othering that I think gets exacerbated. And we heard that in Pascaline's story of the ethnic cleavage that was created, manufactured really, between the Tutsi and Hutu. And this can happen along other lines as well. And so Rainbow Refugee in particular works with folks who have had to flee because of rising backlashes against people who are sexually or gender diverse. And we see this criminalization in over 75 countries around the world. And this is very much a legacy of colonization. These laws were imposed by European colonial powers and are being worked through and fought against now. And as people rise up to assert their rights, that is when we often see the most extreme and violent backlashes.
Thank you. So I guess to reiterate this question, to think about it a different way, what is Canada's global responsibility when it comes to refugees? And does Canada play a role in producing refugee movements?
I would say absolutely. So I moved to BC from a city in another Canadian province where one of the main drivers of the economy was manufacturing, and one of those manufacturers was creating armed vehicles that were being sold to Saudi Arabia. And one of our speakers tonight was from Saudi Arabia, right? So I think that we can't just look to the country where the movement is initiated without understanding what are the dynamics that are contributing to what is happening in those quote-unquote refugee-producing countries. And so do Canadian industries have dealings in those countries? And are they involved in the kinds of activities that are pushing people to flee? And I think you wanted to add something about that.
When we're looking at sort of Canada's contribution to forced migration, another area to look at is extractive industries, so the mining industry. We have 3 Canadian mining companies right now in court because of human rights abuses. And we're finally seeing that courts in Canada are starting to see that as part of their jurisdiction. So I think it is important to look at not just sort of, as you said, the conditions in the country, but what has contributed to those conditions and our role in that.
you want to add?
Sure. I think that I can talk about, in my perspective, what I think Canada's responsibility is. And I think it's threefold. I think it's moral, and that's the first and forefront of how I see our refugee system as person to person, and seeing somebody having been fleeing persecution and not having the same innate privileges that you have or that I have. And so I think that there's a moral side to it. There's obviously a legal side to it, and that's the nerdy side of me, the law, our system here as it is in this country, the international treaties and responsibilities that Canada has been at the forefront of. And then economic as well, and understanding that, as the speakers were talking about earlier, that refugee individuals bring with them a plethora of experience, of knowledge, of beauty, and only positive things can come from that. And so when you look at it from those three, moral, economic, and legal, I think we have a responsibility to do the most that we can as a country.
I'd like to hear a little bit more about this legal side. So under Canadian law, who's considered a refugee, and what is the refugee resettlement process like?
Okay, so I can shed a bit of information in terms of what the refugee resettlement process is like for inland refugee claimants. So that's what I do. It's individuals who have come to Canada through whatever means they've come to, whether it's at the border or they've come through the airport, and they make a claim from in Canada. A refugee claimant is really the Canadian term, but it's somebody who's outside of their country of origin, who's seeking protection based on a persecution that they're facing, whether that's a convention ground or a personal situation that they're going through. We have both ways that they can get that protection. And the resettlement, I can only talk about the beginning part of it, because that's the only part that I'm involved in, and resettlement goes on much longer than that. But first step is deciding to make a claim, and then filling out a bunch of forms that ask you everything you've done for the last 10 years without leaving any gap in time. You can imagine what that's like to fill that out when you're carrying the stories that you're carrying and some of the things you've been through. And then it involves making that claim, going through an eligibility assessment. Then it involves getting a medical exam, waiting for your work permit to show up at an address that you probably don't have yet. And then there's this quiet period where your life is waiting on either having a hearing or being expedited or being decided without a hearing. And so that's the beginning stages of what it looks like, on paper at least. That's what I can give you, is the on paper, of what it looks like to come to Canada to make a claim inland.
Sherilyn, did you want to talk about?
Sure, I can touch a
The other
bit
side.
on, so we also resettle refugees who are overseas, and people who have fled their country of origin because of persecution, made it to another country, and are able to register with the UNHCR, are then able to apply for resettlement. And this overseas resettlement applies to, or is offered to, less than 1% of refugees who need it. So we're looking at, the UNHCR estimates about 1.4 million people at this point are in need of resettlement, and this is based on them being vulnerable and at risk in their country of first asylum. And yet the number of resettlement spaces available globally each year is usually less than 100,000. Canada, each year, we contribute about 20 to 30,000. This process involves waiting and trying to stay alive in a country of first asylum, and for queer and trans refugees, this is a daily struggle, and for many refugees, for women, this is a daily struggle, even making it, to a safe place to go to the bathroom or get water. They are facing danger of assault. Waiting for resettlement, processing times vary from, at best, in the Syrian initiative, we showed that when we're organized, we can do this in less than a year and have people to safety in under a year. But there are great regional inequities in this, and so there are other parts of the world where people are waiting 4, 6, 7 years to have their applications processed. And that's after registering. And there's a whole period of time before that. So it is a lengthy process. There are long, again, as Kay described, there's long application process, thorough security checks, medical checks, all of that. Each of those things involves a level of having to kind of yet again tell your story and yet again go through scrutiny. So it is quite an arduous process. I want to emphasize the level of survival and resilience just to get to that point.
Pascaline, Dashis, I see you both nodding along. What does it feel like to live through that process?
Well, I think I can speak. It's on? Oh, thank you. I think I can speak to this from someone who went through sponsoring my own family, and also my own being sponsored by UBC, World University Service of Canada branch. I think the World University Service of Canada branch and the national branch actually worked quite quickly, that I was able to be resettled within 1 year, but that's not the standard. I tried to sponsor when I came to Canada, I started to sponsor my brother and sister. At that time, Kenya had changed its policies around refugees, because they say, I think there is this misconception in other countries as well that refugees cause trouble and everything. So they shipped everyone who was a refugee, even if designated by United Nations, they shipped them to camps in the desert. There are two brutal places called Dadaab and Kakuma. These are actually camps in the desert, in the almost Sahara desert, and it's very hot. My brother was there for about 3-4 years while waiting for the sponsorship to go through. My sister, out of safety, we managed to hide her somewhere. So the process took about from 2001 to 2007, 6 years. This was really hard on me because I had to prove that I had the economic means of supporting them. I had just finished my studies. I had just entered the workforce. I had a very hard time to continue my studies because I had to keep working so my sponsorship could stand. So it's a very huge, daunting process, very traumatic, financially draining for people trying to reunite with their families who are in unsafe environments. So very difficult. That's what I would just say.
Yeah, so to speak to that, I can still remember I was very little. So from 2003 to 2008, that's when I think that's how long it took us, me and my sisters, to be able to come here. So imagine from that time, so we had to go for like all these like medical treatment. I think I don't know how many times we did that, about 3 to 4 times, and we had to like change locations of where we live. We had to go to the embassy for different tests. And yeah, so it took us very long, to the extent that I even forget that, I was traveling and Canada was not on my mind. And I wasn't even thinking about it. And then this one time, sister just called me and said, "Hey, Dashis, I want you to come to this place." She didn't tell me what's happening. Went there. "Oh, we're leaving to Canada tomorrow." What? Like, because I even forget that I'm supposed to travel. So yeah, that's how long it takes, and you often don't realize that you will travel anymore. Yeah. And actually, there's something also I'm planning to do for my mom, to bring my mom here. So now that I know how long it's gonna take, I'm gonna be very patient about that. But I'm still, I'm very motivated to reunite with my mom, because I haven't seen her for the last 8 years, and it will be very great to see her, because like I'm a student, yeah, I'm working, but at the same time helping her back home, helping my siblings to go to school. Like Pastor Lynn said, at her turn, it is very difficult
for a young person like me. I'm just traveling to survive, but at the same time, sponsoring someone, even though I'm supposed to better myself. Yeah, it's difficult for sure.
So, Pascaline, you just mentioned that there's often these conceptions or misconceptions that refugees are troublemakers, they cause trouble. I'd like to hear us talk about that a bit more. Is the system safe? What are the security screenings for resettled refugees and refugee claimants like?
I actually wonder why people think that refugees are a source of danger, because the vetting system is so elaborate, is so, in French they say minutieux. I don't know the word to say, but it's just so elaborate, detailed. You know, people come through the borders, they go through detention. They have to detain them until they prove their identity, they prove to a judge that their stories are true, that they actually did not have any other country to go to. It's amazing. So refugee goes through, it's like an X-ray. I would just compare it to an X-ray. So for me, I would say, yeah, the system is very, very, you know, I don't even know the word to use. When we were sponsoring my sister and my brother, they had to prove as well the same thing. Criminal record check, medical record check. We had to ask for the country where we come from, for documents. And this is so hard. Sometimes you've left for so long. So I think Canadians should feel, the people they should feel least worried about should be the refugees, because they have been really, really checked. Yeah, I would say.
Yeah, just building on that. We were talking earlier, and I started to realize that people may not be aware of the checks that go on through the refugee process. So in immigration law for the inland claims, but for everybody immigrating to Canada, but I speak about the inland, there's two concepts, admissible and inadmissible. So for inadmissible, it can be a whole list of reasons that you're inadmissible, whether that's criminality, whether that's being involved in an organization. There's international inadmissible, or national inadmissible and international, so things under the UN conventions, exclusions. And the admissibility process begins from the very first moment that a person makes their claim. They make their claim, they come back about 3 or 4 weeks later for an eligibility interview. Then their information is sent out, and on the back end, which CBSA doesn't share this information with me, I don't know why, but on the back end, they're doing all sorts of checks, and in theory, you can't actually have your refugee hearing until the screening has come through the CBSA. Throughout that process, they're doing admissibility checks. On your evidence, the refugee division takes a look at your evidence. If they think there's an issue, they identify it to the CBSA. I've had cases where admissibility has been at the beginning, and I've had cases where in the middle of a refugee hearing, somebody mentions that they were part of some political party, and it's done. And we're now 4 months later in an admissibility hearing, and the refugee is entirely paused. And so I think that there's this the information about how rigorous the admissibility process is not very transparent, and people don't quite understand the amount of checks and balances that people are going through and how examined their life is. As I was mentioning earlier, the form of everything you've done for the past 10 years. You can't really mess it up. They're looking at that form with you across the table, and they're questioning you on everything you've put on that form to make sure it's correct and to make sure you have evidence to corroborate it. So the admissibility element goes all the way up until even past citizenship, and we were talking about how that's another issue for another panel. But it's always there. There's always somebody or some process or some system looking at you when you're an immigrant or when you're a refugee to make sure you're admissible.
I just also want to comment that it's often political leaders raising this idea that refugees are security threats or that there might be terrorists hiding among refugee flows for political purposes. And this is misinformation. CBSA's own statistics show that among asylum seekers who arrived last year, less than 0.3% had any kind of criminal record. And those ones were the ones that, as Kay said, were screened out. And so it is very much for political reasons that this idea of refugees as threats are being used. And I find the logic becomes kind of circular. The fears are raised by claiming that there are threats hiding among the refugees. And then those fears and fear of political backlash is used as a reason not to allow more immigration or refugees, or not to change the levels. And it becomes this circular logic.
Yes.
And quickly, just to add to that, a few years back, I did a discourse analysis of the Protecting Canada's Immigration System Act. And that sort of construction of threat was used strategically actually to enhance ministerial powers, right? And so it was very strategically political in the sense of giving the minister at that time more discretionary capacity than what that role had previously held, by creating this sense of fear that was not based in fact, but was constructed for strategic purposes.
I'd like to also now think about fairness. Do we think the system is fair? And I'll let the political scientist chime in now that we're on to politics.
Is that on? Yeah. Yeah, I like that question. Is it a fair system? Is Canada doing its fair share? So we heard earlier that Canada admitted 28,000 Syrian refugees last year. That was all over the paper. We had wonderful photo shots. Canada even made spot number 1 in the kind of ranking of countries who resettle refugees. And so does it mean it's fair? We're doing everything that we can. I mean, I guess you can guess what my answer is. Right? Once we go beyond those 28,000, well, how many refugees get resettled? 81,000 last year. That's a very small amount of refugees being resettled if we consider, as Sherilyn reminded us, that we have 1.4 million waiting, being desperate to be resettled. So that's spot number 1 is, within a league of countries that are not doing an awful lot to resettle refugees in terms of the actual capacity they have to deal with larger numbers of humanitarian immigrants. And so when we look at where refugees are waiting to be resettled, and more generally, even looking at the 26 million refugees that the UN Refugee Agency has identified, where are they today? They're not here. They're not in the US. They're not in Europe. They are in countries in developing regions, countries that have very little capacity to deal with these numbers. And those countries, they don't have an option to say, this is not fair, we don't want those people, because they're conflict regions and people move, and there's nothing you can do unless you use a lot of violence to stop those flows. So the fact that we can ask ourselves this question, is this a fair system? Are we doing our fair share? I think that already reflects that we have a lot of choice. And it's kind of up to us how we use that power we have to make a decision. One group that is often talked about much more negatively than resettled refugees is inland claims, as Kay talked about, asylum seekers, people who enter Canada either through a border crossing or they fly into Canada and make a claim. And there is some of that dynamic to kind of assume that asylum seekers, they're the kind of bad refugees because we don't want them here, right? Canada has been really lucky to build a really well-functioning immigration system that allows to use kind of government language, managed migration. We really like to manage it. And management is great, but there are certain things in life that you just can't manage, you can't control. And refugee flows are one of those things. And to kind of think of people that we don't select to come here, but that have as good a reason to arrive here as resettled refugees who we select from overseas, to kind of put them in a different box kind of misses the point in terms of really why people feel the need to move. So I think that's something that's I think we need to think more about, especially as we hear language and political discourse by some of the, people running in this election in terms of, the danger of these illegal border crossings, what's happening in Quebec. These are the same people that then, we have photoshots about in terms of Syrian refugees. So I think that's one thing I would say. The other thing, looking at Canada's immigration system more broadly, it's a system that is kind of upheld as a model system in much of the world. What percentage of our immigrants come as refugees? It's not that many. It's 10% right now. It's 15% because numbers have gone up. But it's not a system that's rooted in humanitarianism. It's an important part, but given we have this amazing infrastructure to resettle immigrants to support, whereas many countries don't have that, I think there's a lot that we could do. So that's not a great answer in terms of fairness. What is fairness? I think that's a very high bar for it to be fair, but I think there's no question that we could do a lot more than we're doing and still do it very well.
So, Antje, in your response, I hear you're thinking about fairness in two ways. The first is what is Canada's responsibility in the context of compared to other countries, and is that fair? But the other way you've touched on is about refugee claimants, right? And how in media and public discourse, often on social media, there's this sense that refugee claimants are jumping the queue, especially with respect to irregular border crossings. I'd like to hear other panel members sort of react to that sentiment.
Just briefly, I think one thing that's been really good about the UBC migration is that it's put us in contact with people who are studying similar things from different perspectives. And I recently attended a presentation from a faculty member in law who has been studying what's called the Safe Third Country Agreement, which is essentially an agreement between the United States and Canada, which, and again, I'm going to use a very problematic term, but this idea of like asylum shopping, right? So there was the sense that if you've arrived in the United States is a safe country, and so you should be seeking asylum there. There's no need for anybody to be coming into Canada from the United States in order to seek asylum. There's certain people we don't want to discuss tonight, but the situation in the United States has changed in the last few years. And so perhaps that situation isn't as safe as it once was for the people who are coming from there. But the point is that Canada is a signatory to the United Nations Convention for Human Refugees, and that we, people have a right to seek asylum. And so we shouldn't be closing doors just based on where they're arriving from. And so the issue for me is that this is a problem that the Canadian government created for itself. And so to say people shouldn't be coming in irregularly, sort of at Roxham Road, well, they're only doing that because you told them that if they made that claim at the land border, for instance, at, the Rainbow Bridge in the Niagara region where I'm originally from, that it would be automatically rejected because they should have done that in the United States. They should have made that claim there. So you create a loophole and then you criminalize or problematize people for using a loophole that you yourself created. And so I think that's what's problematic for me, is that the Canadian government enters into this Safe Third Country Agreement, which creates this very new and kind of unique problem, and then we get upset about the problem and point to the refugees who are crossing there. But you've essentially forced them into that situation. If you would just let them cross at the port of entry, the official port of entry, then that's probably where they would go, because that would actually be a lot easier for them, right? And that they are making a claim when they get to Roxham Road. Like, they aren't kind of sneaking in. Like, they're still following the procedure that you very clearly described. So there really isn't anything clandestine about it in that sense. And so what Efrat talked about when she was presenting this is that we do have this geographic border, but through these policies, the governments create these more symbolic borders that they push out to say, like, it's not just the border with Canada anymore, but if you're in the United States, we're all, you can't come in from there. And it sort of extends the Canadian border outward toward the south, or extends the border outward into these other countries. That creates these kinds of problems.
Yeah, when I hear the words queue jumping, I get very confused because I can't figure out what the queue is. Because in essence, we have two systems, and within those systems, there's multiple other systems. But we have two systems. We have an Immigration and Refugee Board in Canada. It's 300 West Georgia. On the 18th floor is the Refugee Division. Refugee claims are heard from inland claims. So we have one queue that is the inland people who are in Canada or who have made it to Canada who are claiming protection. And then we have the out of Canada systems, and there's again multiple. And they're the out of Canada, and they are not having hearings at the Refugee Division. And so I get very confused about which queue you're jumping because they're two very separate arenas and two very separate systems and processes. So I don't know the queue. I don't know how you're jumping a queue. It's very confusing.
Well, just to add to that, it's not just the case that however many asylum claims we receive has no bearing at all on resettlement numbers. It's completely a parallel track, but that extends more generally to family class immigrants and economic immigrants. Again, it has no bearing on those numbers. So it's a really false sense of a trade-off that doesn't exist in how these policies are made.
We don't have a refugee crisis. We have a responsibility sharing and solidarity crisis. And Canada has an important role to play in stepping up in that, using the language of irregular migration and illegal border crossing does not help. We have an obligation to meet our moral responsibilities under the UN Convention to keep our inland asylum system accessible and move it towards fairness, while also continuing to have a robust resettlement program. 86% of the world's refugees are being hosted by countries that are low or middle income. We can and should be doing more. We could do that through our migration system. We could also do that through how we target our development funds. Canada does not meet its sort of the UN recommended level for development assistance. That is only 0.7% of GNP. We're down around 0.27%. If we did more and targeted that towards countries of first asylum to create safer conditions, sustainable conditions, the UNHCR is trying to meet an $8 billion mandate on $4 billion. And that's because countries in the West are not fulfilling their obligations.
So we've talked about these perceptions surrounding security, surrounding queue jumping. I want to turn to questions about integration now. So some folks are also concerned that refugees are a drain on the economy, for example. Do refugees receive social assistance, and how are refugees affecting the local economy? I think I'll start with Kay and then Dash.
So again, I'll speak through my experiences with my clients, watching them go through it. Refugee claimants, once they have their refugee ID document, and that step is important, are eligible for social assistance. And from my experience and the clients that I work with, it really is transitory. It's in an effort to be able to stabilize themselves. So when somebody comes and makes a claim for refugee, they wait for a certain period before they get their refugee ID document. That document is how they get a bank account, and social assistance requires a bank account. So if you think about the time frame, we're already looking at about 4 to 5 weeks from the time that they originally made their claim to when they got the ID. They can't work. Oftentimes their money is tied up internationally and they don't have access to getting it out. And then they get their refugee ID document, but they still have to get their work permit. It's a totally different step. That can take 6 to 8 weeks. Sometimes it can take months. And it can take months when you don't have an address to send the work permit to. Or you send it to 555 Homer Street, the shelter you're staying at, but you're not staying at that shelter anymore because you don't have a bed. So you have your refugee ID document, you're waiting for your work permit, and it doesn't show up, and you're 2 or 3 months later. It's hard to fathom how you could survive in that situation. And so I get a little bit anxious when I hear people talking or using a narrative of free money or using the system when I'm watching it every day in this transitory period for these people who, from my experience, every single one of my clients, and I've been doing this for a number of years now, wants to work immediately. They want to get to work. They either have education or they want to go and get education, but they want to work. So they're waiting for their ID document, they're waiting for the work permit. Months have passed by, and so they do receive social assistance when they get the bank account. Usually that's about 4 to 6 weeks after they've arrived or they've made their claim. And they use that until they're able to start to provide for themselves. And I know other people will be speaking to this, but it is a catch-22. We were talking about it earlier. They wait, let's say, 2 or 3 months before they get their work permit because they had to resend it because they're not at that shelter anymore, they're at this shelter. They can't get housing because people are not allowing them to get housing. They get their work permit and then they're not getting employed because they have a work permit and because they're a refugee and because of the languages that they speak or how they look. And so it's hard to fathom how the system could at any point be equitable if there was not for this assistance that was provided in this transition period. And so I see my clients going through this cycle continuously, and then you hear the narrative that they're using money or that they're soaking from our system, and it's not accurate. This is a necessary part of the resettlement process. It is necessary. And then you get individuals years down the road, or even sooner than that, from the moment they come here, who enrich Canada. And it really is a privilege and a blessing. And if we look at it from that perspective, I think that the debate around existence can minimize a little bit more.
Yeah, this goes back to where I will say again, refugees are not burdens, they are opportunity. So refugees, they come here to find employment and to integrate into a new country. Despite the disadvantage they face, such as learning a new language, getting into a new culture, dealing with the losses, the trauma they face from back home, and difficulties finding jobs, and all that, losing your family members and all that. So when they come here, they need something to cope to. And I can relate to my experience. So when I came here at the age of 13, and I had to spend 2 months in the house because, I was only here with my dad and my sisters. We're new to the country. My dad's working. I don't know anyone. I don't know where to go. I couldn't start school right away, so I had to stay in the house because I need to be safe, right? I don't know anything about the country. I don't know, like I said, I don't know where to go. So that's why I had to stay in the house. And though I was dealing with all my past experience, it was very hard to just get into society or to get the Canadian cultural experience. So I found that very hard.
It's really an interesting question. I find that in the human nature, sometimes we like to dramatize. Sometimes you look a lot on the negative instead of looking at the positive. And I'm just thinking about this question that the refugees are a drain. Well, I think for me to respond to this or to actually oppose this saying is Canada is a country of immigration. So we do naturally welcome other newcomers, economic immigrants. And as we say, refugees are like other immigrants. They just come in different circumstances. And to be honest, Canada cannot expect that there won't be any investment at all to welcome and settle immigrants, because immigrants contribute to the economy of Canada. And it's Canada rely on this immigration to keep up. So there is a bit of investment to be made, which is far less considered the return on this investment. And refugees are no different. They need a bit of support at the beginning, but the return on investment is greater. So I would just give an example on myself. I was a young person. I I had gone through high school. I was at the university. It took me less than 3 years. I finished my university. I got into work in the workforce. I never used any income assistance. I paid the tax. I do everything that other Canadians do to make Canada a better country. So where is this myth that we drain the system? And we are a workforce, we are human capital, and this is what Canada needs. So we need to stop looking at refugees in a different light, because they are also immigrants. They just come in a different, under different circumstances. And of course, there will be some slight investment to make for any immigrant to get the return on the investment.
And we do have a social safety net, right? We have social systems in place, and they aren't unique to migrant populations. So when I had a child, I was a drain on the Canadian economy while I was on parental leave, right? Like, we support people in our community to get them, back on their feet. And I think that when you pull people away from their extended family members, when you pull people away from all of the kinds of supports that I take for granted in my day-to-day life, something has to help fill that void, as you said, especially in that very short term, right? So I think it is that sense of short term versus long term, and that the support that is given is very limited, both in amount and in time. There are a lot of eligibility criteria attached to what services are provided for whom. Not everybody is eligible for everything, so there are no blank checks, and even when you go to access services, those services are very prescriptive. Their settlement agencies are funded to do certain things for certain people, and when it comes time to go beyond that, really their hands are tied. And so I think it's very tightly managed in that sense too, but it at least gives the sort of bare minimum of support to get people on their feet. And in doing comparative studies, you see how the experiences are different in countries where these services aren't available. So we talk about wanting people to be successfully integrated, but then we put all of the pressure of that integration on that individual. And I think that if we don't want marginalized populations who reflect the kind of myths that we tend to hold about them, then we have to help each other succeed in our own society. And I study primarily the role of community spaces in helping not just economic integration, but social and cultural integration. And you see how much people are contributing both in the workforce, but beyond the workforce, right? To having kind of healthy, thriving communities where you know your neighbors, and who are the people that I have met volunteering in my son's school. A lot of those people weren't born here, right? So people contribute to the fabric of the society through all of their daily occupations, right? Like, who are you meeting at the coffee shop? Who are you meeting at the schools? Who are you meeting in your church, at the mosque? That these are people that we live and that we know every day. And bonjour Pascaline, I've known Pascaline since I moved here from Ontario, and I didn't know until today that she had a refugee background. But she helped welcome me into the Vancouver community as a French-speaking person, where I was looking for, où sont les francophones à Vancouver? Oh, Pascaline's there, she'll help me. Right, so it should be much more reciprocal than it is, and it's a beautiful thing when it happens.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember immigrating isn't easy for anyone. I think those of us who have arrived here from elsewhere, through whatever paths we took, we realize you turn up and the expectation that you just know how everything works and that you're going to be successful in all these, realize all your dreams, that's going to take time. And when you look at refugees, unlike economic immigrants to Canada who the Canadian government selects with kind of trying to maximize the chances of them finding employment as soon as possible by prioritizing people with high levels of education, people who already speak English or French, those are not valid considerations when you're looking at providing humanitarian protection. Right, so you've got 80% of economic immigrants who arrive here fluent in English or French. That's the case for 30% of refugees. So the determination required by refugees is really high to find that way into the labor market, and that's why the services that are provided here are really important to allow for that opportunity to then become something that has a positive impact. But kind of taking a step back from the discussion of, how long does it take refugees to become economically successful, the answer is 12 to 15 years, and they're no longer distinguishable from native-born Canadians. That's the average number. But if you set that aside, I just want to remind us that we welcome refugees because they're in need of protection, not because for economic growth reasons. That's an unintended and very nice side benefit, but that's not the rationale. We have economic immigration for that, right? And I think we need to really be really careful. Many years ago, the Canadian government tried to actually have economic considerations when selecting refugees. And those who were most at risk from danger did not make it into Canada because they were seen as too expensive. Right? Thankfully, with 2001 legal changes, it has changed, and there is now recognition that there is something really important that we have to do by focusing on those who are most in need of protection, and welcome them and prioritize them for resettlement in Canada.
I just also want to add something to just what you just say. I know there is a time that the immigration policies were leaning towards how can we get the least expensive immigrant. And it was quite funny because you know what? You never know who will eventually be the most contributing immigrant. You may think this young person, highly educated, no kids, no wife, I mean, no dependents. You may realize when they come here, they may not really be able to stand isolation and may actually not fare well compared to maybe that mother who was in dire situation in the refugee camp, single mother with children. I've worked with family who came in these Kakuma camps. They are, what do we say, low skills, but you know what? They are the people who are working on some of the jobs that the Canadians are not wanting to do. They are fully employed. They are so attached to the labor market to make their family survive. Their kids are doing well in school. At the beginning it was hard, but they are integrating, and tomorrow these are the kids who will be Canada of tomorrow. So it's hard to judge, using this economic, who's gonna fare well in the long run, because people, they contribute, each person contributes. It could be economic, could be social, could be cultural, and Canada needs all these facets of life.
So I want to make sure we have time for your questions. So I'm going to end on a little controversial, loaded question. With the federal elections right around the corner, what would you recommend to our future political leaders when they're making public statements about and policies for refugees? What would you like them to know?
So as you might have gathered from my accent, I'm from Germany originally. And Germany, like many other European countries, really are embroiled in some really, really nasty populism right now, and that really focuses on immigration, where public debate becomes more and more polarized, and people can't even have a normal discussion about refugees and about immigrants. And one big reason why this has happened is because political parties have really instrumentalized the issue of immigration for electoral gain. Not even necessarily for ideological reasons, but because they wanted to scare people and get more votes. And this is something that I've always been very grateful living in Canada, that this environment here is not like it is in many European countries right now. But there are also seeds of that happening. And we hear leaders, especially using, again, the issue of asylum, irregular border crossing, illegal border crossers as one of those wedge issues, trying to kind of divide people and gain votes. And I would say be really careful what you do, because once you set that process in motion, even if you want to stop it, it's really hard to stop that. and people are becoming more and more divided. And so for me, the big hope would be for kind of thinking of our elected leaders in terms of moving toward unifying us, not using a particular part of our population to divide the electorate.
I'm from the US and I don't know how that feels at all. Anyone else?
I would say I have 3 suggestions. The first is that we need to get rid of the third safe country agreement. It's high tide that we recognize that the US is not a safe country or a safe alternative. I speak from, absolutely. I speak from the queer community, of course, if you haven't noticed, but also specifically the trans community, and just as an example of how unsafe America is, or the US is, for trans refugee claimants are often, when they're housed for detention, as we do here in Canada as well, housed for detention, so incarcerated. Trans refugee claimants are often held in isolation, and a number have died while incarcerated. That's not a safe alternative, and it's time that we recognize that. The second is that we need to invest in our inland system. We have increasing numbers of people who are coming to Canada and making claims in Canada. That's the reality of what's happening. So let's set up our system for success rather than continuing to debate about its downfalls, even though we have a solution that I think we could easily implement. And the third, at least for politicians and for people who are representing the community, is to get involved in the community and get to know individuals who have come to Canada to seek protection. I can speak from my own experience that I have the best job in the world. It's a privilege, it's an honor to carry people's stories with them and to advocate beside them. And I think it changes you. I know it changes you. And so I think that if you put yourself into those communities, you will be a better person and you'll be able to govern more appropriately.
I would just echo those statements. I think it's really valid to say that we shouldn't be pitting, one group of the population against another, and I think that we shouldn't be re-victimizing people that we've welcomed into our country for political gain, right?
Echo all of these asks, demands, expectations. I would add to that. We have an incredible resource here in Canada in that we have citizens who want to engage in solidarity. One of the great privileges of my work with Rainbow Refugee is seeing ordinary people step up and form groups and become kind of the people who walk alongside a refugee for their first year in Canada. And it is powerful, and people are changed by it. They become fierce advocates through this process. And we are already actually expanding that to other countries to create additional resettlement spaces. But I see power in that, in also how we defend the right to asylum, in how we make sure that people who arrive through the inland process are also given those same kind of community welcomes. It's really, this is a resource that we have, and so I hope that an incoming government would do all of these things, resist populism, suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement, please, recognize that a refugee is a refugee is a refugee, regardless of whatever pathway they come by here. Fund communities to become sustainable, safe spaces, and really continue to engage citizens in the work that we all want to do in solidarity with refugees.
And think critically. I mean, these messages are conveyed in a way to be persuasive, so it's very easy to accept them at face value, but the purpose is to always be thinking, who isn't being captured by this message? What story is left out of this, right? What is Canada's complicity in this? What is my community's role and responsibility in this? So I find that the focus is always on problematizing an other, and we always need to turn the lens back on ourselves and say, how have we contributed to this and what can we do about it? And I think the suggestions about what we can do have been made very eloquently.
Thank you so much. Now we're going to turn it over to you. Questions from the audience.
Thank you. So before we begin the questions from the audience using Slido, one of the elements of today's event was to be able to have a conversation with some of those who are running for the federal election, giving them a space to briefly respond to some of the things that they've heard, share some of their thoughts, and then pose a question to the panel. So we did send out invitations to all of the candidates running in all the Vancouver ridings from all political parties. And so I know at this point I have Breen Ouellette from the NDP here with us. If there's anybody else, please raise your hand. But I am going to hand the mic over to Breen and just give him an opportunity to respond, especially in light of the last question that we had to the panel. And then we will go to the questions on Slido.
Thank you. Thank you for what you've said. I apologize for not showing up on time. I got double booked because of the election, but what I was able to hear, I was very grateful to listen to and to accept, so thank you. And I want to respond to what each of you said. Polarization created in politics. The NDP recognizes that this is a problem and that it needs to change. Ending the safe third country agreement with the United States is part of the NDP platform. We want to end it. Getting involved in the refugee community. This is where I start. Thank you. The pathway shouldn't matter. Absolutely, and the NDP recognizes that. And we specifically want to ensure that the Safe Third Country Agreement is ended because we recognize that members of the LGBTQI community are especially impacted by that. And promoting community is something that the NDP does best, in my opinion. I think that we are a party for people. We try to raise everyone and ensure that everyone has an equal opportunity in this country to thrive. Someone, and I'm sorry I can't remember, but I took the note, someone said something about 12 to 15 years to see a return or to see a break even or something like that on a refugee. We have hundreds of thousands of people in this country every day that we are, you could say, we're waiting to see a return on them. They're children. And we don't complain about children. We don't want to send children away. So why do we have a different standard for refugees or any immigrant? We need to change the conversation in this country. We need to push back against the language. One last thing I want to say about the NDP platform. We want to promote development assistance tied to human rights undertakings and insist that undertakings from countries receiving development assistance are met. So we don't want to. We want to ensure that that countries are meeting those standards of human rights if we're providing development assistance to them to ensure that we see that. Thank you very much. So now, the question. Based on what I've said, if you were Prime Minister tomorrow, what's the one thing you'd do first for refugees? Thank you.
So I see Dash is smiling. Do you want to tackle that question? Okay, we'll come back to you. Pascaline, please.
Well, I hope I will be Prime Minister one day, but but the first thing I would do would be to increase the numbers of accepted or number of refugees that we accept in Canada. I think it is true we need a capacity to welcome and settle and integrate refugees. But I don't think Canada is doing enough. We can do more. Thank you.
Like Paxolin, I do like to be a prime minister someday too. So like you, I would also like to increase the population of refugees that comes into the country. Reason why is that if you look at the population of Canada right now, like the older generation, they are in the stage where they're going to retire soon. And how could you be able to replace them? So when you bring in more refugee can have kids, and that next generation can be able to fill in that job, the spot that the older generation is in right now, because that term's going to be over soon. And you need the young people to take over. That's that.
I'm going to, oh, go ahead.
I just want to say, the NDP will welcome either of you if you want to get involved. Come on, when?
Yeah, probably at 8 p.m. Yeah. I'm going to give I agree with them, so I'm going to use my turn to give a much more specific answer. And I'm going to build on something Pascalian said about not worrying so much about the different streams. So for instance, I'm very committed to the federal government's goals of increasing levels of Francophone immigration, and they've set a target of, I believe it's 4%, that they have consistently failed to meet. There are a lot of French-speaking countries currently experiencing civil unrest. Why can't those French-speaking newcomers be refugees to meet that target? There's no reason we can't just bring in much larger numbers of French speakers as refugees to meet that 4% if express entry isn't getting the job done. Because as we've seen, and as we see right here tonight, there's this myth that, if you aren't coming through a skilled stream, you're unskilled. It's simply not true. I think it's been shown that to have this level of resilience and to make this journey, you have to have a skill set. And I think that skill set is overlooked through systemic racism and discrimination, through xenophobia, through accent discrimination, through regulatory bodies that don't recognize foreign credentials and work experience. The barriers that refugees face to successful integration are not their own. They are placed there by our society. And all of these boundaries that we have created, we can dismantle. So we can meet the targets that we set by just, bringing people in through different categories. It's not, and I hate using the expression of rocket science, because what I do is hard too, but it's not rocket science.
The first thing I would do, which would get me sued and then kicked out of office, I would immediately restore legal aid funding in Ontario for representation of refugee claimants. In BC, refugee claimants are supported through the legal aid system, albeit with downfalls, and perhaps the capacity is at issue. In Ontario, under their government, this has been a very controversial topic, and refugees are not getting representation the way that they should be through a very inaccessible system that is filled with legal jargon and turns around the corner that make zero sense. So in terms of what I would first do that I think is an actionable position would be to restore that funding, albeit it is within the province's jurisdiction, but not when I'm Prime Minister. This video will come back and haunt me. I just know it. I know it.
Well, just because Kay didn't say it, I would suspend. I would suspend this Safe Third Country Agreement. First act, very quick, and make a statement.
While we're playing with this fantasy of being Prime Minister, yes, after suspending the Safe Third Country Agreement, as a psychologist, I know that for people to recover from trauma and get out into the world and participate, what they need is a basic sense of safety restored, and they get that through having their basic needs met: safe housing, a livable income, safe public transit, same kinds of things that every other Canadian needs. So I would start with something like a guaranteed minimum income. I would start with free transit passes for every single person who comes as an inland refugee, or a refugee, convention refugee. And I would get rid of, we have this horrible policy left over from, I'm not even sure when, that we actually expect people who come as resettled refugees to repay their airplane tickets. And we charge them interest.
And they can't sponsor other family members.
And yes, they can't reunify with their family members until that is paid. It is a horrible policy, and it needs to go.
How it should be, yeah, as a collective.
That's going to be one heck of a campaign. I will not be your campaign manager for that. I don't have the strength. So we have about 2 minutes left, and those questions are coming through on Slido. And part of me wants to just say thank you very much, and everybody have a nice evening, and end on the wish of one of you guys being the prime minister. But I think I'm going to take it to one of the questions from Slido. And we talked about this being a safe space. We talked about this being a brave space. And so being a brave space means that somebody can ask a question that doesn't always feel good, or it doesn't show the values that necessarily we share as a group. But it's having the guts to type it in there and vote on it and really hear what the answers are. So we're gonna have this one, but you're gonna have to give super fast responses to a super tough question. So I'm going to pose the question to Yang Yang and then let her make a decision as to how the question goes from there. No pressure. Why should we as a society spend money on refugees when we have a park full of homeless people needing support?
Because we can do both. And there's no reason not to.
Who else would like to chime in?
Yeah, I mean, the time for pitting marginalized and oppressed communities against one another as a focal point of political debate, in my opinion, we're past that. It's not getting us anywhere, and there's work that needs to be done. And as we've said, and as my friend has said, we can do it all. It's within the budget, it's within our capacity, it's within our privilege, and not only we can do it, we need to be doing it all. So the debate needs to, they won't love this in office either. The debate needs to quiet, and we need to do it all. Yeah.
Okay, so that was good, guys. Good job. Okay, so we're going to end on this question. What do you think is at the core of many Canadians' opposition to immigration and refugees? Is it fear? Is it racism? How do we combat this? Send us out on a what can we do note.
I think to a large extent it is fear of another. My supervisor for my master's degree was a white South African, and she could pass as Canadian. And she never, people would say, well, you're not really a refugee. And she'd say, like, no, but really I am. And so I think that it is a heavily racialized issue. And I think that fear of an other that's created and perpetuated through things like media and myths needs to be dispelled by hearing stories, by getting to know your neighbors, by just getting to know people. And so I think that a lot of times it's an abstract sense, and then when you get to know people, you think, oh well, I didn't mean like him from the job, I mean them, right? So
I think perceived difference can be scary for people, and I think a lot of folks are really feeling quite insecure economically. Even if they have a job, they're worried. They don't feel like things are just going great. And I think feeling insecure for all these good reasons, once you see somebody who's different from you and who you don't know, that can trigger more fear. So I think it's a very normal human reaction. And I think one of the things I'm taking away from the panel is just a commitment to meet more people who are unlike me and see where others are coming from, understand what makes them tick.
Last words, anyone?
I think I'm agreeing with just what you just said, that fear and just some other agenda, I think, around wanting to, some economic agenda, people feeling insecure. Also, some people also have views that are, I would say, regressive, because they just want to live and be with people who look like them. And but I don't think Canada can really take that path. It's a multicultural country. We've gone a long way, and we have to look at difference in a positive way.
Well, I think that's, and anyone else? I think that's a great end to the panel. Please, let's give another round of applause to our panelists. We learned a lot.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. So on your Slido, if you're on the app, please go into the poll. So when you look at your phone, on the one side it says questions, and on the other side it says polls. Please go into the polls and quickly fill out the evaluation in there. It's really important for us that we hear from you. We hear from you your thoughts about the event. So on behalf of Young and the panel, on behalf of AMSA and the All Welcome Here Coalition and UBC Migration and all these amazing partnerships that I get to participate in every day, thank you so much for being here tonight. Safe travels home, and we will see how things go on October 21st.